welcome to this channel, I guess. Today I'm speaking with Dr. Phil Parker, and before I ask you to introduce yourself, for me, this is a time of great revelation. Lots is being revealed to us, and one of the things that is revealed to me is that this is the time, if anybody is interested in trying to find some kind of truth that's going on, I recommend being very skeptical but open to everyone and everything, and educate ourselves about what makes sense, what's logical, what's not logical, what logical fallacies are. And so I'm just going to point out one logical fallacy, which is an important logical fallacy that a lot of us fall for. We've been trained to fall for it, which is the fallacy of authority. So whilst I invite you to tell us all about your qualifications, I don't want anybody to fall for the the idea that just because you've got qualifications means that what you say is not to be subjected to questioning and skepticism. So without further ado, please, would you like to just tell us a little bit about yourself? And
yeah, sure. I completely agree with you. I think that too much of the time people substitute expert authority for really thinking things through for themselves. And we have to remember that expert opinions are still opinions. You know, they're based in lots of information, but certainly in my experience, sometimes the perceived or given truth, which may have lots of evidence to support it, it doesn't mean it's the totality of all the information out there. It's just what's been published. There's a very interesting whole conversation at the moment in science about, you know, how do we measure truth? What is the currency of truth? And one of the big currencies of truth, and as we're seeing at the moment, is what's been published. And to get things published, there's all sorts of hoops you have to jump through, all sorts of grants you have to get, and all the rest. But that's coming back to your original question. Who am I? Why am I here? So I'm Phil. I've been working in health since the 80s. I first trained as an osteopath. So working with physical medicine, then I became very interested in people who come to see me with, you know, pains, and there was no real kind of moment when they lifted a big heavy thing that caused their back to go. It turned out there was other stuff going on in their lives which was more emotional. So, you know, they weren't happy with their life or their job. So I also did additional training in hypnotherapy and Ericksonian psychotherapy and brief solution therapy to try and look at how do we deal with both the physicality of health and the psychological, psychosocial areas of health. And I worked clinically for a long time doing that. And then I started to get involved in research, develop some new ideas. And for new ideas to get any traction, they have to have research. So I ended up doing a PhD in the psychology of health, where I did a number of clinical trials and published a thesis. And my kind of speciality is really in looking at how the mind and the body interact. And that kind of comes back to my original trainings in physical medicine of osteopathy, and where we had to study anatomy and physiology. We used to do human dissection when I did it. You know, it was like pretty full on, all the way through to looking at the psychology of humans and how those two things interact. And as soon as I say mind and body, people often misconstrue that as, oh, what he's saying, everything's in the mind and the mind is responsible for everything. And it's not. It's very much this idea of the mind and the body being one, that there isn't really a distinction apart from in textbooks, that the mind and the body are separate. And this a lot comes from, of course, Rene Descartes' kind of arguments about that mind and body must be of different material because you can't experience them, perceive them in the same way. And we got stuck in that a little bit in Western medicine. And now what's really interesting is loads of research has been done into, you know, how does the mind affect the body? How does the body affect the mind? You know, and which I'm sure we'll talk about. And we talk about some of the work around placebo studies, which is really, really interesting stuff. So I guess that's my background. You know, I've ended up being kind of an expert in the mind and the body, looking at the clinical applications of how we can influence our physiology by the way we think, how our physiology affects the way we think, and how there is this kind of two-way street between these two, they're not even separate entities. There's this kind of totality of us as humans.
Okay, and just very, very briefly, if you want to just tell us that you've also set up the lightning process. Really want to keep it brief because that's not what this is really about, but just very briefly, maybe people can find out more about it. I'll put a link down in the box. Do you want to just say something?
Yeah, really, it follows on from that. It's applying the science of the mind-body connection. What is the research that says that we can affect our physiology by gaining better conscious control of our neurons and our hormones through changing the way we use our brain? So if you go to lightningprocess.com, you can find lots about that and the published papers on it.
Okay. So I wanted to speak to you particularly about the situation we've got at the moment with COVID. Lots of really seem deliberately scary messages out there that we're getting on the news. I don't watch the news very much, but they are, it's not rocket science to know that they're trying to get as many people to watch them as possible, and therefore they're as sensationalists. They're trying to create sensation. So there's a lot of that out there. And I want to start with perhaps with what might be considered as something that's negative, but I don't think it is really. But I want to start with that and then move on to the positive, because I know that one of the things that I'd like to do here is to have create a series of videos that can help people, manage their lives in this time and in the future. And I wanted to particularly speak about the nocebo effect, and as well as that, after that, then to come on to perhaps what you might say that people can do to strengthen their immune system, and how their immune system, how much of their immune system is tied up with stress, etc. So can you just explain the nocebo effect and explain how that might be related to some extent, some degree, not completely, to what's going on at the moment?
Yeah, great. So one step back, I guess, the placebo effect. Most people have heard about the placebo effect, and the placebo effect has got a bit of a bad press. It's like, oh, that's just a placebo. The reason you're responding is just a placebo effect. And it's much more important than that. The placebo effect, according to many researchers, is present in every single medical interaction. So if you have surgery, some of the effect of the surgery will be whether you like the surgeon. That's well documented. In fact, the original guy who was responsible for, considered the father of surgery in medicine in America, said he wouldn't even work with people if they didn't think they were going to get better. He just refused to operate on them because he thought he had observed so much that people didn't respond as well as he would hope if they weren't in the right frame of mind. So every single interaction, whether it's surgery, taking drugs, having physiotherapy, exercise, the color of the room, color of the pills that you take, for instance, there's a whole bunch of studies on, for instance, in Italy, if you give men a blue pill, it's much more effective than any other color. And they think it's because of the football team being, the Azores in Italy. So different countries have different relationships to colors. It all sounds crazy, but what's really fascinating about it, and I've just done a series of interviews on this with some of these researchers, there's a really straight, super academic researchers looking at what is going on here. How come people are responding to what's called specific effects? So when you give someone a drug with a chemical, you expect them to have a response to that chemical, and non-specific effects, which are results you don't really understand. So placebos are where people get positive responses from being told they're being given a real pill or a real treatment. It's actually a fake treatment, and they still get the results as if they'd have the real treatment. The nocebo is the other side of that, where people respond negatively to a drug or a placebo, so sham treatment, and they get a negative response. And you might think, well, that doesn't happen very often. Well, the latest studies by a friend of mine, Jeremy Howick, which was published in 2018, they did a study of 250,000, so it's 250,000 participants. Any guesses as to how many people who took the placebo, so they're trialing a drug versus placebo, right? So people on the placebo, so they're not really getting any real medicine. What percentage of people have side effects? What do you reckon?
5%?
49% had side effects, severe adverse effects. That's huge. And what's interesting is they're having effects, side effects, real physical, rashes, headaches, digestive problems, a whole range of stuff. But the medicine they've been given is empty, it contains nothing. And they tend to get the side effects that you would expect if they'd taken the real pill. And so there's a whole bunch of research into this dilemma we have in healthcare, which is we have to give informed consent. So we have to say, look, if I do this to you, there's a chance this could happen. But the research is also very clear that as soon as you say that, you're going to encourage that response. So there was one study where they found they had 3 hospitals doing the same drug trial. And there was some kind of administrative error. So one of the hospitals didn't give out a piece of paper saying, this may cause you digestive problems, right? So 2 of the hospitals, all the people in those arms of the study all got the warning, this could cause you digestive symptoms. One hospital didn't get a piece of paper. And what they found, of course, was that in the hospitals where they'd gotten the warning leaflet, there was a 6-fold increase in reported digestive system symptoms. And that was purely because of the information they were being given. If you look at neurological diseases, in trials with MS, 74% of people on a placebo will report nocebo responses, so negative responses. Parkinson trials, 64, epilepsy, 60% of people, depression, 57, pain, 52. So it's just massive. And what it is the mechanisms behind it are that they think people have an expectation, particularly if they're told this may cause you this symptom. If they see other people responding in a negative way to an illness, and if they've had experience of, I've had this pill before and it caused this issue for me. And they've been looking at their kind of deep, minute physiology, what's going on in the various receptors and all that kind of stuff that's probably not worth going into at this point. So placebos, nocebos, and then you also asked about news. So I dug into some of the research into news. Now, our kind of experience is, you would imagine that news, particularly negative news, would have a negative impact. And I would say that probably most people have had that experience, but as always with science, we have to go, is there any research that backs that up? Have they done any studies? And yes, they have. They've done quite a few studies. And they find that, so there's an Israeli study when there was some kind of exacerbation in the conflict over there, and there was more news and people watched it with more frequency. So they were able to note that people were getting more constant streams of the news, the scary news. And as a result, people became more anxious and produced more symptoms of anxiety. So there was a 1.6 increase in at least one symptoms of anxiety, decreased sleep, and general increase in fear, just as a result of watching the news cycles. And I'll tell you a really interesting thing, which I think your viewers would be really interested in. It's a relatively old study, but they were looking at, does news increase anxiety, depression, and is that related to if people are optimistic or people are irrational, right? And they found a really slightly strange response, because I imagine most of the people who watch your channel are pretty rational, like thinking like, I want to look at this, I want to think what I think about it. And what they found was, if people watched the news, there was an increase in anxiety, and it was moderated by whether people were rational or not very irrational. So if they were kind of quite logical or irrational. And you would imagine that people who are rational would be more anxious as a result of the news, but they found exactly the opposite, that the people who are the more kind of rational, logical people, according to the scales, had a stronger anxiety response to the news media, which was counterintuitive. And I think the reason was that for people who are logical, most of the time, you know, they're kind of understanding the world. It's all making sense. They don't tend to over dramatize things. And so they were more affected by this dramatic information coming to them through a relatively, you know, valued source than the people who were more used to being, you know, over dramatic and irrational about things. So lots of interesting research around it. And at the moment, yeah, I completely agree. There's a big problem with news. They have to fill that slot, don't they? They've got the half an hour. There's nothing happening at the moment. It really is just virtually nothing happening. So what are they going to talk about? And I remember back in the Gulf War, I really noticed it, how before people would report about the news, but now they were sending K-80 or whoever it was, and she was like dodging the bullets. And then it really was like trying to get you to emotionally respond as much as you could so that you would become hooked. And that, again, there's some evidence that, you know, the dopamine system is activated and these kind of things, and that becomes like we want to get back in that, want to re-experience that. And the final thing I'd say about news, and I'm waffling on, I know, but there's some interesting stuff about the effects of catastrophic news items versus constructive news items. What's the effect? And unsurprisingly, the negative, you know, amplification of those stories increased people's sense of stress, but interestingly, also made them feel there was nothing they could do about it. It decreased their sense of action, that there was anything worth doing about it. Whereas constructive news stories increased their positive emotions and gave them a sense of there was things they could do about it. So that's kind of interesting as well, how that would affect people's sense of agency.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I mean, I sort of usually sort of go to the humorous side of things, and I think you probably pull me back on this, but I've sort of been on a couple of my videos, I've suggested that that the nocebo effect can cause people. So I've suggested that basically, you know, you can kind of catch the illness, so to speak, through your ears and eyes. By keeping on with this whole negativity and all this negative figures and propaganda that I see as propaganda. But I remember when I sort of touched on it with you, you sort of pulled me back from that idea. What would you say to that?
I think that the thing you ought to be careful about is buying into that, oh, it's all a hoax, none of this thing exists. When it doesn't look that way, it looks pretty clear that there is something going on biologically, and so we can't catch it, you know, through watching media. But there is also some truth to it in that your immune. So Pasteur famously, you know, who identified the germ theory of disease, on his deathbed, apparently he said, you know what, I got it a little bit wrong. He said the soil is as important as the seed. So it's not just the bug, it's what shape you're in when you get the bug. And we're certainly seeing that, where some people respond, you know, have the bug and they're fine, and other people, you know, really take it, you know, like Boris Johnson, for instance, he's been knocked absolutely sideways, and yet what's his name, the medical advisor, has also had it, and he's back at the podium, Chris thingy. So the reason you're right is the stress, the anxiety produced by the frenzy of watch out, this is dangerous, and also some of the, you know, real problems have been stuck, isolated in a house all the time, with no garden for many people, with people you may find difficult to be with, or people who you're starting to find difficult to be with, or your kids, or no food, or no money. You know, there's a lot of stuff going on, and long-term stress has a very, very clear suppressive effect on your immune system. And so on that level, absolutely, if your immune system's on its knees and you get the bug, then you're going to be in definitely worse shape. So I think there is absolutely some truth to that. Okay, so what can you tell us about how people can boost their immune system from your point of view, I'd say? Yeah, and what's interesting is there are lots of things you can do. So there's a whole practical bunch of stuff which many people know already. So exercise, which is a bit tricky at the moment, but we are allowed to go out a bit, boosts your immune system. Eating well boosts your immune system, but also decreasing your stress. So there are lots of things. Again, you can come to my website. We've got loads of free resources about this. We've actually got a whole series, in fact, for people who are on the front line of the NHS, because they're under even more stress. They're not only coming into contact with the virus probably daily, but they're having to deal with all the pressure that they're under. So there's loads of free resources we've got, which is probably the best place to check these things out. But anything you can do to reduce stress. So most people have some mechanism they use, whether it's relaxing, watching TV, dancing, listening to music, all that stuff's fine. A really simple one to do is, again, the research is good on this, that if you remind yourself of a time when you felt really happy and relaxed, then naturally, the more you get into it, and you may need some help in guiding yourself into that, it will increase your levels of calmness and it will decrease your stress response. So when we have stress, we have a spike of cortisol. If before you get stressed, you are in a calm space by recalling a positive memory, that instead of being a spike, there'll be just a little kind of bump, so it won't affect you nearly as much. So it kind of insulates you a little bit from stress. There's all sorts of stuff as well you can do around dealing with other people, which is actually one of the biggest things we need to deal with, particularly at this time, because just the friction of people being together, it just does cause trouble. A couple of things I would recommend, very simple things, is avoid the why question. And the why question is the question that people ask when they're not actually asking a question. They don't really want to know the answer. It's this why question that goes, why haven't you taken out the garbage again? Yeah. So you're not actually interested in the answer of why that's happened. You really want to say, I just want to let you know you've messed up. And there's a really interesting thing about humans, which is one of the things we hate the most is when somebody says to us or suggests to us that we're wrong in some way. And when someone suggests to us we're wrong, what we normally do is we come out fighting and go, I think you'll find if somebody's wrong here, it's you. And then we get into some kind of argument. So avoiding the why question is a really simple way. It's not that the why question is always bad, but if you're asking the why question, you want to ask yourself, am I really interested in the answer to this? Or is this just me trying to blame someone or to try and point out someone's failings? If you're doing it for that reason, it's probably just going to end up in conflict, and it's worth avoiding that.
And anything else? Because
loads of stuff you can do. A real simple thing to do is breathing. And there are lots of ways to do breathing. First thing is it's important to breathe to oxygenate yourself, but which everyone does. But it's about regulating your breathing. So a real simple way to do it is to count 4 seconds in and 5 seconds out, whatever works for you in terms of time. But usually the out breath is slightly longer. And what you'll find when you do that, if you're like me and probably like you, you'll get really bored and your mind will start zipping around thinking, well, what I'm having for dinner, what's going on? Oh, there's a squirrel, that kind of conversation. And what you need to do instead is, as soon as you notice that, is just bring yourself back to counting the 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 seconds of breathing in and out. And by doing that, you're training your brain to be a bit stiller, a bit calmer. You're training it to just stay focused. And also you're getting into a good rhythmical pattern with your breathing, which is good for oxygenation. It's actually good for your immune system. It helps to pump around the lymphatic fluids. It helps to move your sympathetic nervous system, which comes out in the middle part of your spine. There's all sorts of stuff it's good for. So that's an easy, simple thing to do. Yeah.
Just one last thing. From your training as an osteopath, is there anything in terms of how we hold ourselves as well, how our posture is there anything that we can do about that and how?
Yeah, really, it's one of the things we've got to watch out for is being inactive. It's really easy, when you've only got 4 walls to pace, to just sit still, sit on the sofa, not do much. So stretching, moving ourselves is good. Collapsing and slumping, which compresses our rib cage, is not good for us. It means we don't get much oxygen because there's just less capacity. So making sure that every now and then we kind of stretch. As I said earlier, there's the sympathetic nervous system, so the nervous system is divided into a number of bits, but one of them is the sympathetic, which is about stress. and the parasympathetic, which is about calming you down. The sympathetic nervous system comes out from the top of your neck all the way down to roughly where a bra strap would be, that kind of section of your spine. That's where those nerves come out. And if you get really tense in there, it does influence how well that part of your nervous system functions. So calming that down by making sure you breathe and move would be really useful.
Thank you very much. It's been really good talking to you. Thank you, and thanks for all your work. And maybe we'll speak again sometime.
Brilliant. Thanks, Danny.
Okay, all the best.
You take care. Bye.